There is no useless experience, as read by the author. Lesson 4. You can always begin again as long as you are still breathing. Todd Stocker said that sunrise is God's way of saying, let's start over again. I love it. American baseball legend Yogi Berra said, it's not over till it's over. Pastor Humphrey Omondi of the Sirikwa Pentecostal Church Eldoret, who is also Dr. Omondi now, put it this way in one of his sermons. Put your hand over your chest. Do you feel that thump, thump, thump going on in there? As long as you can feel your heart beating, that's a sure sign that you can start again. Those words are what got me through one of the most storied moments of my life. It was 4 years into my stay in the US. In that time, I had enrolled at Washburn University and dropped out again, as was my custom. It was 4 years into my stay in the US. In that time, I had enrolled at Washburn University and dropped out again, as was my custom, after my first 2 semesters. In those days, students could work just about any numbers of hours off campus to sustain themselves. Most African students did just that, me included. The fundraised money would only stretch for the first semester of college. Thereafter, you are expected to stand on your own feet, as many others had done before you. In my case, I had the benefit of having gone and found my sister already established. At 23, she had done pretty well for herself. She was juggling studying for a degree in biochemistry at the same campus and had 2 jobs that afforded her an upmarket apartment and a late model Lexus. The young lassie was doing well in the land of the free. I got odd jobs for a while, working in various warehouses after class, and did everything from packing stuff, forklift driving, washing trucks, telemarketing, counting coins in a mint, serving as a cashier at a gas station, working as a security guard at a supermarket, and even truck driving at some point. Hardly staying at one place for long, because I always was looking for the one paying bigger bucks. After some time, I landed what was then a stellar job at the Coca-Cola Mid-America Company, first as a merchandise manager and then a territory sales manager. The job came with a company van, an unlimited fuel card, and a salary that shadowed my sister's 2 jobs combined. The working hours were, however, full-time and weekends. I attempted staying at school by way of attending night school for a while and managed to juggle my balls up in the air for 2 weeks until my first paycheck came and my report came undone. I looked at the zeros at the end of my pay figures, and I was done with school. After all, I mused, don't we go to schools to learn and then make money? Isn't it here now? That foolish decision was unknowingly how I began my journey back, because with my dropping out of school, I immediately violated the terms of my student visa. I was now officially an out-of-state immigrant in the United States, and the INS, that is the Immigration Naturalization Services, was not known for suffering fools of my caliber. Nonetheless, since that didn't seem like it was happening at the time, I threw caution to the wind and completely forgot about what had led me to America in the first place. That job at Coca-Cola gave me a lot of pride. I purchased my dream car and began showing off with lavish parties and endless road trips to different cities in the US for Kenyan parties to live it up. I never missed a single Kenyan get-together, from Dallas to Washington, D.C., and from the twin cities of Minnesota to the black capital of Atlanta. I was everywhere. It was at that point, too, that a relationship I had from my days in Eldoret went south after I was busted cheating on my then-girlfriend with one of her former schoolmates. I greatly regretted that action because of the heartache that I caused her. That kind of terrible mannerism cost me that relationship and laid a backdrop for my reckless lifestyle when it came to relationships. It was atrocious behavior, but unfortunately, it was the kind of stuff that defined my 20s. At work, I was an excellent worker, often surpassing my targets, but also busy finding excuses to be away for days at a time to attend to my lifestyle of partying. The road to destruction always has signposts, but we speed through them courtesy of the tunnel vision caused by the high velocity that feeds our vices. I wasn't slowing down, not even literally. I got 2 speeding tickets in quick succession, but this didn't faze me. At one point, I was almost caught in an alcohol dragnet that was placed right behind me in traffic while I was drunk driving. Even that served as no deterrent to put some brakes on my acquired lifestyle. Not long afterwards, a year into my employment with Coca-Cola, I was called into work and told we were doing a review on our qualifications and that the authorities wanted all of us to bring in proof of our American citizenship. It was standard practice in those days to simply tick citizen on job applications, and they didn't question much, and that is what I had done to get that job. Those were the glorious pre-September 11th days. This query for proof of citizenship presented a huge dilemma for me. I couldn't prove I was an American, and that violation alone would have earned me jail time as well as a deportation. And I really didn't want to leave the job. So I asked for permission to go home and get the documents. I left the van at work, went home, and told my sister all about it. After conversing with her, it was obvious what I needed to do. I informed our landlord that we were moving that afternoon due to some emergency back home. By evening, we had begun the move, and I had made a decision that I was going to leave the state so that things could cool down just in case they began a search for me there. By this time, we were living in a huge duplex in an upmarket neighborhood off Rother Road in Topeka, Kansas, courtesy of yours truly. I knew that if they got me, they would get my sister too, because in that season, she had been out of school for 1 semester as well. I packed up a few belongings, placed them in my car, said goodbye to my sister Edda, who was very heartbroken by the turn of events, and began a long drive out of the state of Kansas. I was very upset because I knew it was a Kenyan who had ratted me out. It was happening a lot in those days. Kenyans would call the immigration authorities on others they thought were doing well. Sadly, it was fueled by jealousy. I focused on my driving and turned my thoughts to my destination. I had called a friend, Daisy, who lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and who had accepted so graciously to let me stay in her house while I got my bearing. Sadly, I would later abuse this friendship by upping and leaving without warning, leaving her with huge bills to pay. Thankfully, we mended fences years later and are now good friends. My sister, meanwhile, changed neighborhoods in Topeka and stayed on at her jobs. She had repeatedly warned me about my lifestyle, but it had resulted in huge fights, which at one point even turned physical, forcing me to leave and stay with a friend from Eldred, called Carey in Carbondale, Illinois, for about 2 weeks before we resolved our issues. I wasn't listening to anyone because I was the man with all the loot. Meanwhile, as I settled in the neighborhood of Kennesaw, Georgia, the Coca-Cola company tried to reach me through multiple emails and calls. They didn't know they were negotiating with a felon. Eventually, they ceased pursuing the matter when I emailed them to let them know that I had gotten a better job elsewhere. Life in Atlanta was good. Kennesaw, where we lived, was quite upmarket and right in line with my insatiable appetite for the good life. Daisy shared an apartment with Ron, who was an amazing dancer and was known for perennially winning all the Kenyan dance competitions. He was a Kenyan who had been in the US at that point for just about 2 years longer than me, but he spoke the American slang with such finesse that if you never knew his last name or origin, you would never know he was Kenyan. I became their roommate and would sleep on the couch. My new roomies were quite the party animals, often going out from Thursday to Sunday. If you have ever been to Atlanta, you know it can serve up all manner of entertainment practically each and every night of the week. I quickly ran through any money I had on me from my last paycheck, got broke, and began getting into arguments with my roommates over small issues. Things as small as someone leaving their pizza and me eating it, and so on and so forth. It was time to get a job. I had a car, so that was a plus. Getting a job was a Herculean task though. I wanted to maintain my previous lifestyle, but this was a big city, and the opportunities were fewer, and I had no papers, so my options were limited. Eventually, I ended up working at a gas station, where I became the darling of many Kenyans eager for some extra cash. I began moonlighting by illegally selling alcohol. I stocked this under the table with the help of my new friends. I'd sell the liquor, and we would split the profits. It was good money, but still wasn't as much as I had made in my previous job. For a while, it was what serviced my excesses. My drinking went on unabated. In December 2002, I slept while driving home from a party and crashed my car into a tree. I knocked it somewhat sideways. The car still moved, but the collision had caused a huge dent on the side, noticeable by police. This drew a lot of attention and made me an easy target for roadside stops, which I couldn't afford given the violation of my visa status. By this time, I had fallen out with my roommates and had moved out. I was living elsewhere in town with a young girl who had just come from Kenya. I had met this lady at one of the Kenyan parties. She was trying out her hand in music and the arts and is now a very successful musician plying her trade in Europe. She needed a place to stay and I had a house. I needed a distraction and so we ended up together. She was available and homeless and I was available and lonely. We were both using each other. This arrangement went on for about half a year. At this time, I realized that I either needed a new car or I needed to move. Nobody was going to buy it in its damaged condition, and only people I knew who could lived in Kansas. So I bought a car bra, which is basically a cover that is used to cover the front bumper end to end. It looks like a bra and is usually black and was quite popular those days. I covered the dent with it, and when my live-in girlfriend was at work one day, I packed up and left for Kansas, driving 12 hours straight, and arrived at my sister's house. She was elated to see me. It had been almost a year since we had seen each other last. There, I was able to sell my car the following day. After a fortnight, I bought a rather nonchalant-looking Oldsmobile Cutlass, and then proceeded to Stillwater, Oklahoma, where I stayed with a former schoolmate, Ken Kibet, who had invited me to work there all summer. Apparently jobs were plenty at the warehouses over there and they paid decent money. He called me because he knew that I desperately needed a job. At this juncture, let me just say that keeping old friends can be currency in itself. Some of the greatest help I received then and have still received in my life now is from former high school mates. In my time in the US, I visited Ken, who is still in Oklahoma, Walter was in Nebraska and now lives in Perth, Australia, and John Plapan, who lived in Birmingham, Alabama, and now lives right here in Nairobi. Plapan made a successful turnaround after he came back from the US, becoming a very accomplished aircraft pilot, and with whom I have had the privilege of flying numerous times. My time in Stillwater came to an end after 2 months, when the company laid us off. By then, I had already spoken with Edith, another friend in Atlanta, who told me about opportunities in the Motorola company in Elgin, Chicago. I had never been to Chicago, but it was worth a try. She was moving from Atlanta with her roommate, Liz, and we came to an understanding and they went ahead to secure a 3-roomed apartment near the city. They arrived a day before me, and I pulled up into the Windy City as it's known after about a 14-hour drive with 2 rest stops. I only had a few belongings in the car. We settled there and 2 of us secured jobs at Motorola. The third got a job elsewhere and our working hours never matched. We hardly saw each other in that house and it was like we were each living alone. I got a second job at the Chicago Tribune, making calls to customers about their newspaper subscriptions. I hardly knew anyone in Chicago, and this greatly helped me stabilize myself as I was devoid of bad company for a while. Things back home weren't rosy either. My dad Saddam had just lost an election after vying for Member of Parliament for Mount Elgon back in 2002, and he had spent a lot of money on it, as is typical of Kenyan politics. It was time for me to give back. In Kansas, my sister had also been caught drunk driving and had had her license suspended, costing her one of her jobs. She too was in need of money. Those responsibilities sobered me for a while. Meanwhile, in Chicago, I began a new relationship that quickly began to become serious. Things were shifting all around me, and it seemed like it was beginning to be the best of times. However, as sailors tend to say, the calmest of seas could be the sign of the worst storms ahead. The Motorola company in Elgin suddenly shut down, laying off a lot of people, including my roommate and I. The hours I worked at the newspaper were too infrequent to sustain me. We could no longer afford the apartment, and it was a hard decision to agree that we had to part ways. I sold all my properties again with a view to moving in with my girlfriend who lived in Winona, Minnesota. As was the norm, I put all my belongings in the car and headed north. I was stressed and drinking heavily as I drove to Winona. Although I arrived early that evening without incident and sufficiently drunk, I insisted that we go out on the town to celebrate my arrival. Of course, that meant more drinking. By the time we got back towards 2 a.m., I was completely inebriated, and I remember a quarrel starting over the usage of money. It quickly escalated, and before long, I was storming out to continue with my drive, although I didn't even know where I was headed. To her credit, this lady pleaded with me not to go, but I was having none of it. I wanted to show her that I was the man in the relationship. I got into my car, started the ignition, and blasted away. 10 minutes later, I was on the highway towards Iowa. At this point, I was thinking to myself, let me just get back to my sister so that we can start over and be serious about putting our lives together. But Kansas was a whole 12 to 14 hours away from where I was, and I was exhausted from driving earlier, drowning myself in alcohol and arguing with my host. I needed to sleep. My eyes caught a signboard for an American Inn beside the highway written $34 a night. I pulled in and asked for a room for the night. I paid with a checkbook and used my already expired passport for identification. For some reason, that night, I couldn't find my driver's license. The attendant checked me in and I went straight to sleep. All my bags were on the floor and I had only changed into shorts and a t-shirt before I blacked out. I was awoken by the sound of a huge bang. A few seconds later, I was pinned to my bed by some men shouting all manner of words of surrender, and there were many different bright lights in my face. A pair of cuffs was slapped on my hands, and I was gruffly brought to my feet. The law enforcement agencies had caught up with me, and I had finally been arrested. Apparently, the backstory was that the front desk receptionist at the inn had seen my passport, noticed it had expired, and called the INS. This was post-September 11th. No sane American was taking chances with dubious and suspicious immigrants of any kind. The INS had quickly checked their database and realized that I had been out of status for 4.5 years at that point. They sent the local police for me, who, in their usual American style, showed up and put perimeter fences and barricades all around. Apparently, they had even spoken to me on the loudspeaker, but I was too deep in sleep to hear that. They then had made a decision to storm in, concluding that I was a fugitive who was planning an attack. I thank God I never woke up. There is a high probability that if they had found me seated on the bed, the scenario would have turned out totally different, and I would never have lived to tell this tale. I was taken to a city called Eau Claire, where I was jailed for a day, and then to the INS headquarters in Minneapolis, which was about 2 hours from there. All charges were laid out for me there, and there was no denying it. I was an out-of-status immigrant who had worked illegally for many years. I had written a couple of bad checks in Atlanta and had been arrested for drunk driving once in Illinois on a visit to my friend Carey together with my sister. I had other violations like indecent exposure because at one time on a road trip, my friends and I had peed outside on the highway and a state trooper happened to be passing by. I was also accused of animal cruelty because one Jamhuri Day, I was among some friends who bought and evaded abattoir charges by slaughtering a goat in an apartment. Cops had been informed by a nosy neighbor who could not mind her business. I confessed to all charges. It was all over. I was sent to a prison in Rush City in the state of Minnesota, awaiting determination by the courts on my fate, which was going to be deportation anyway. It was a newly built prison, and I was informed that I would be isolated because they didn't want to mix me with hardened criminals. The humiliation on entry is something I try to keep out of my mental Rolodex. They strip you naked and search all your orifices, making you open up for them. It wasn't funny, and I cried a lot. With a singular phone call that I was allowed, I reached out to an ex-girlfriend of mine who was a Kenyan American, the one I had cheated on, and asked her to call my sister and inform her of my arrest. She accepted to reach out to my sister, and I'm forever grateful that she was of help in that moment when she owed me nothing and when I wasn't deserving of her help. I asked her to advise my sister not to try contacting me, as the INS had a history of shaking down siblings. Luckily, we didn't share surnames, and that made it unlikely for them to trace her with ease. The first night, all my infractions and violations of the law in America, some of which I do not have the grace to mention in this book, hit me hard, and I wept. It was hard adjusting to my new detention routine, and I often cried myself to sleep at night. The routine was fairly simple. An offender would be in the cell for 12 hours and out in 2-hour intervals with breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a time to shower. The toilet was in the cell, so they didn't think you needed much time for other things. In my periods in the cell, I would read the Bible, sing, and play a game called Start Stop and XO that I used to play as a child. I would sing in whispers, as shouting was prohibited, and I would speak to myself out loudly, seemingly like a madman. I can tell you now that not everyone you see speaking to themselves is mad, because sometimes the only voice you need to hear is your own telling you that it will be okay. During the breaks while in prison, I met friends. I met many Africans when I was in there. One had been fighting his deportation for 15 years and was from Kibra and said he couldn't bear the thought of going back there. According to him, Kenya had nothing to offer him, and his people were poor anyway. Plus, he hadn't spoken to them in like 11 years. I also met a Nigerian who was just a gangster. He had been deported twice, had returned to the US twice, and was facing deportation again. In spite of these facts, he was vowing to return again. I doubt he can do that now with all the biometrics in place. I also met a Ghanaian man who spoke to me about Jesus and told me that since we would probably never meet again, to make sure I look him up in heaven, as he would most certainly be there. His name was Lawrence Rawlings, like his presidents at the time. I have never forgotten him. I will certainly be looking him up when I get up yonder. I was in Rush City for 6.5 weeks, exactly 44 days. On March 21st, 2004, my cell was opened and I was informed that I was going home that very night. I was processed out of the cell and handed my belongings. They included my car keys, my wallet, which had about $43, my shorts and t-shirt, and an overcoat that was given to me as it was still winter. I was driven to the Minneapolis airport, taken to the lounge, and cleared for departure. I was allowed one phone call. At that moment, I called my sister. I told her in Sheng and bits of Sabaot, since authorities listen in and have Kiswahili interpreters, that I was going to Nairobi via Amsterdam aboard a KLM flight. I gave her my flight details so that she could give them to my parents. Then I apologized for ending up this way. We both cried, and then I was told that my time was up. It was the last time we would ever speak again when we were both on American soil. At 19:30 hours, Minneapolis local time, Flight 656 to Amsterdam took off into the grey, cloudy sky, carrying aboard the shattered dreams of a 27-year-old Kenyan man who had gone to America with nothing and was leaving with nothing. The nightmare was just beginning. I put my hand over my chest as we bypassed the clouds into the starry skies above. There was that thump, thump in my chest. It wasn't over yet.